And now, for our speaker, Dr. Florian Rappl is a solutions architect for IoT and distributed web applications at Smapiot. His main interest lies in the creation of innovative architectures that scale in development and usage. He won several prizes for his work and is a Microsoft MVP in the area of developer technologies. He regularly blogs and writes articles for popular magazines and websites in the web development space. The title of his talk, Micro Frontend Discovery, the missing piece of the puzzle. Please, a big pink stage round of applause for Dr. Florian Rappl.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Much appreciated. Welcome after lunch. It's always great to have many folks here. Hope you're ready now for the second half of the day. Before I dive into the topic, also a few words in addition to the introduction. Yes, I'm specialized in distributed web applications, and yes, I write a lot of blog posts and articles. One thing to add here is I've also written a book on the topic of this talk called The Art of Micro Frontends. So if anything that I say sounds interesting to you and you want to read more, this book could be a good reading choice. There are other options in the micro frontend space. Two options are Building Micro Frontends by Luca, and also the Micro Frontends book by Michael Gers is one of the options that I can highly recommend. Now, in the morning in the keynote, we heard already it's always about context, right? To give some word meaning. And one word we also heard in the introduction was scale or scalability. And depending on who you ask, what is scalability, without now giving much context, you will get different responses. And if I would ask you now, what do you think is scalability? Well, everyone here would have his or her own opinion, and you would all be right, I guess. So let's ask, for instance, a developer, what do you think is scalability? And there could be multiple responses, right? One developer could say, well, for me, it's the first time to commit on a new project. If that time is really low, then I think this project scales well because onboarding is quite fast. Also, a developer might say, well, easy deployments, if there's a fix that needs to go to production, well, it should be really fast and really easy to do. There shouldn't be much hurdles here to accomplish this task. And certainly both statements are right. Now, asking, for instance, DevOps guy would, of course, yield different responses. So here could hear things like, well, there's some spike in traffic, we should handle that well. Well, that's certainly correct. But maybe also it's about resilience, right? So yesterday, some part of the system went down, but overall, we still stayed on production. Maybe things got a little bit slower, but overall, we were quite resilient to that failure, right? So also here, this might be right. Now, going further, we could ask your product owner or some guy from business, what do you think? And they, again, they would have their own opinion. And they would certainly argue that for them, scalability means faster time to market. So when I have something in my mind, a new feature, maybe a new business opportunity, the development for that and shipping it, going to production with it, should be as fast as possible. Likewise, even if the project is rather old and established, there should be no feature slowdown, right? So the project should scale well in development. There shouldn't be any noticeable impact during the lifespan of the project. So if you want to summarize now all of those opinions, then I would say in one sentence that scalability is the ability to handle changing demands on a business. So that means new demand is coming in. Maybe it's really a business opportunity. Maybe it's a spike in traffic. Maybe it's a regulatory issue. Nevertheless, something needs to be done, needs to be developed. Something occurs on the system, and scalability is the ability to handle that. Now, with that in mind, if we look on the web, we always had this constant change, and we always, of course, made the next step. We always tried to remain scalable. And that, of course, started mid of the 90s. The monoliths were born. There were single systems, front and back end, all in one place. And there's nothing wrong with a monolith. It also can handle traffic well. You just have multiple instances. Maybe your database now becomes the bottleneck, but overall this thing can also, of course, work. But then, of course, some new paradigms came up, and one of the first things was when applications such as Google Maps or Google Mail showed up, it changed the landscape. And suddenly, you also needed to have bits of information flying in while the application is running, and of course updating the application while it's there. So for instance, in Google Maps, you pan around and suddenly there are new tiles flowing in. Or Google Mail, you click on a mail and only the content re-renders. So suddenly there were a lot more, let's say, demands on the backend, not just render some HTML and that's it, but maybe you wanted to have an API. So you started to separate these things, and one big box became suddenly several boxes. Well, there's of course one thing then why we have now a backend box, because, well, we had dedicated APIs. We might had also more clients, not just, you know, a web application. Maybe we had a native mobile application, a client application. Maybe we also wanted to sell the API as a product. Nevertheless, it made sense to distinguish really between the front end and the back end. Now with this difference here, of course, suddenly a lot more people were working on the back end, and we started getting in trouble here. How do we handle that? Well, of course, there were already patterns at that time, but many of them focused rather on technical aspects than the organizational ones. What proved to be rather successful was, of course, going to microservices here, because here, technically, there were not many constraints, still many decisions to take on your end. But now we had this distinction, and we could have several teams working on unique areas of our backend. And that worked quite well. But now, again, we are at a situation where we say, well, the web as the front-end part is growing again, and now we reached also a size here where teams are just really large. We can't handle that anymore, and we are running into the problems described beforehand. We are not scalable anymore. We need to align on features. We always have this struggle to release. We have a noticeable slowdown. So what's the response? What can we do? Well, what worked really nicely here on the backend side, we might want to do also on the front end. So let's just mirror what we have here as a successful kind of architecture, and we brand it micro frontends, or in short, MFs here. Now that's quite good, but it gives us one clear advantage, and that's why I think already micro frontends are in some way a missing piece of the puzzle. Because beforehand, when we looked at how we could structure teams, sure, we had now different teams for different backend services, like here content service, attribute service, payment service. But since the front end was still this monolith, we also required a dedicated team. And you know what? This team was highly active because it had to touch every of the backend teams, and maybe the backend teams also got in touch with this front-end team. And so there was, of course, a lot of friction, and we required also then dedicated overarching teams like operations and maybe business goals. So what if we could now do real verticals, if you want to say real full-stack teams, that are really self-sufficient? They are fully independent because all the aspects from operations to business to a UI, to an API, they are all covered within one team. They can now work, implement, make their own technical decisions all inside this team, no alignment required. And what happens is you now get, if you follow this kind of breakdown, you now get real cross-functional teams that are structured around use cases, around real business features or business subdomains. And that's what microfrontends are all about. Like the microservices, it's rather an organizational pattern. It doesn't dictate how you now need to implement it, just what should be the outcome. And if you can check all these boxes, you are now fully independent, you can just deploy, etc., then yes, you've achieved that. You've created a micro front-end solution. Well, all in all, what I always say is picking up the famous Amazon pizza team or 3 pizza team approach, that 3 8-person teams are, in general, more effective than one 24-person team. That statement, of course, is only true if there's no additional alignment needed. Because, of course, if they would then need, well, scrum of scrums, right? If they would need a lot of interaction with each other to make decisions, then you're blocked suddenly again. That's not what you want to have. You can only be more effective if you can just work on your own pace, if you can make within a team decisions and already implement them and bring them to production. So, with that in mind, let's have a look what micro-frontends for some people means and maybe what prevents scalability here. Very often you see a line like this, in of course maybe a little bit of a different shape, but in essence it's this line. I have now, let's say, a front-end component, and in this component I want to bring in now another component from a micro-frontend. Well, as easy as this, right? Import component from this other micro-frontend. Well, if you see a line like that, run. Because this means you have strong coupling from your one micro-frontend to something else. I mean, what is this micro-frontend? How do you know that this component exists there, that the micro-frontend might exist at all? And of course, what is the shape of this component? Does the name even be right? Here it's just a default export, but it could also be a named export or something else. How do you know that this exists? So you already have an overlap created here, and this overlap is dangerous. Now you think, well, I can now tell you anything here. How come? How should this ever happen in the wild? Well, it already starts, of course, with the available tooling, the frameworks that are out there. As an example, if we look at Module Federation, which is a plugin for Webpack, this is a bundler for JavaScript code. And Module Federation is one of the tools that allows you to do micro-frontends, at least up to some degree, right? It gives you sharing of dependencies and some other capabilities. And code that you can write is essentially the one that is highlighted here. So let's highlight it. So you got an import of this button. But again, you have here a micro-frontend name that's called here app2. This is a name that you can give it, so let's not focus on this name. But via configuration, you now need to pin this app2 to some real micro-frontend, right, via URL. So there you already know, or seem to know, that a micro-frontend exists. And second, you now need to know what kind of components it exposes. So here it exposes a component called button. And this is completely chosen by this other micro-frontend. So you already use information in your component here, which is a micro-frontend from this other micro-frontend. And you suddenly created an overlap. And if you now think this is just one example, I mean, you can go to the repository. It's fairly popular. I don't know, has 5K stars on GitHub. So it's not something people not take into consideration. They use these examples. So Module Federation makes it really easy to create strong coupling. There's also, of course, a way with Module Federation to not do that, but this is far more hidden. And if you look at all the examples, pretty much all of the examples deal with strong coupling. They just introduce it. Now, besides, of course, the obvious problem of, well, overlapping knowledge, you also create with this strong coupling overlapping features. So consider an example where you say, hey, I got a shopping cart. This is one micro-frontend, and if I go to that shopping cart, it should display, I don't know, some information of a product. And in my new feature that I want to come up with, I also want to show the tags of the product that is placed in the shopping cart. And there's a micro-frontend, of course, for product information, and they are working on a component. Let's call it product tags. And so what you could do in your shopping cart here, you could just import, again, strong coupling, this product tags component. And you're good, you think. But now you have the following scenario. You can't go live with your new version of your shopping cart because you need to wait until the new version of the product information is out there. Because otherwise, this import will fail and your component will fail. So you're dead. Now you waited, this is good, so they released it, great, and you also release, and you think the world is in a better place right now. Unfortunately, the other team discovers a critical issue, and they need to roll back. If they don't inform you that they go back to the previous version, which doesn't have the product tags, then your thing will fail. So you created, or this other team, by the rollback, created a bug in the whole application. So with overlapping features, there comes something that I always call the hidden monolith. And that's the worst of all worlds, because you got the complexity of a distributed system with all the downsides of the monolith. So you don't get any advantages at all. You're not getting advantage by using a distributed system. You're only getting the disadvantages, because a real advantage would be if the other team would do a rollback and you would just say, well, then it's all good. It's still all good. I don't care. This is how it should be. But with overlapping features, it is never good. So don't do that. If you ever create overlapping features and you already see that there needs to be communication between teams about when do you release, when you don't release, run, say something doesn't seem to be working out. So how can we solve this? And one way to solve it is looking what is already out there, because someone else might have had already this problem in another context. Let's take as a context microservices. They have some similar issue. If you consider that gateway from the picture beforehand, that gateway needs to have information of all the services below, right? But how do you get that information in there if you don't want to update the gateway all the time, right? A new service comes up, oh, you need to update the gateway. A service updates itself, oh, you need to update the gateway. That's not the way how you want to scale. It should be implicit, right? And so what they came up with is the so-called service discovery. What you do there is quite simple. So you got your gateways in this example. And what it does is it works against a so-called service registry. You could also say it's configuration registry, or I don't know what, you could give it some other name. The important part is that this service registry can be used now by services, and they can just place in some information there, like information, for instance, who they are, what endpoints exist, etc., etc. So this information can then be used by our gateway, and it doesn't have strong coupling to any of the services, because the services can just update the entry in the service registry, and so this thing will always stay up to date. The gateway doesn't care. It always just, when a request comes in, or you can also make that via an event when the service registry changes, it goes there and it says, oh, what could be the target? Let's see. Ah, okay, it's one service registered. This is the endpoint I proxied to this one here. So then it works quite well. And you decoupled your system by introducing a circ component that's always just used from the different sites, so from the service to put in information, and from the gateway to retrieve the information. Cool. So how can we now apply the same thing to micro frontends? Well, quite simple. It looks very familiar to the picture beforehand, just twisted a little bit. So what we can do, we are now a developer of a micro frontend, and one thing that we can do is we just package our micro frontend up. So what is a micro frontend? I mean, at the end of the day, it's just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Same things as always. Maybe there are some images in there, videos, who knows. Everything that, this fragment of UI that you want to ship contains. Now, what you can do, just packages up as, for instance, a tarball. So TGZ, standard format. When you make, for instance, npm pack, you get out a TGZ. Now, with this thing, you can just publish it to our discovery service. So that's like the service registry beforehand. So you just ship it there. HTTP request, put in an authorization key. There you go. It just takes it, it unpacks it, puts it maybe all on a CDN, and updates our registry information. It now says, oh, I got this micro frontend, maybe I did beforehand, that's the new version, or maybe it's a new thing, I add it to my database. Now this discovery service collects all the information about these micro frontends, and what happens next is that when our micro frontend need to be composed somewhere, might be on a server, might be in the browser, right? We don't care here. We can just go to the discovery service and say, what micro frontends are there. So what we get back is a little JSON, and this JSON contains just all the information. So those are the micro frontends, those are the assets that are relevant. And for the assets, of course, again, they might be on a CDN, so you just get, of course, the links for these assets. And you can then just use them. Great, so this way, we get all the information what micro frontends are there. We still haven't really decoupled our components because, well, I mean, now you can just say you replaced maybe one strong coupling with another more fancy way. So there's still the one thing left that we need to take care of, and that's the strong coupling between components, right? So don't make an import directly on a component from a micro frontend. Now we need to break that line, and we can break it exactly like we saw with the gateway. Because what we do is we introduce a new component, we just call it now component registry, and this one is exposed via a wrapper component. So instead of now always going and importing directly this other component, we are just using a generic wrapper. We can think of it like a web component, for instance. Give it a name, maybe some additional attributes, and it will look up if there have been some registrations on this thing. Now, of course, you can get fancy here. This wrapper can, for instance, offer you to do some fallbacks and additional modifications. But in general, that's the basic idea of it. And with that, of course, your code transforms, and you don't need to do imports. You're just using this wrapper web component as an example, and yeah, use it in your HTML code like this. The name essentially defines the thing that needs to be registered. So give it a better name than component, something that describes what's behind it, of course. So that's the basic gist. So now what can you do with a mechanism like that, and how can you maybe implement it? Let's start with an example. Everyone knows Netflix. Oh, it's one of the things I always like to take as an example. Netflix is great because, well, you can just think about it in a very destructured way where you already apply micro frontends to the Netflix website. So the important part is that when you design, let's say, your boundaries of a micro frontend, you always put things that belong together in the same micro frontend. These might be several components, but they're all, let's say, one logical unit. As an example, when you see, for instance, the browse menu button up there, this one is strongly connected to the browse page. So if the browse page isn't there, you also expect that the browse button is not there. The same holds true, of course, for something like favorites. It also has a page. So I don't want to see the menu entry if there is no page for it, right? So both things, the component that renders the page and the component that's the menu, they should be in the same micro frontend because they form a logical unit. They belong together, right? There are also, for the favorites, there are different things that also belong in there. So for instance, you got this button here. I think you can hardly see it, but the arrow points into it. So that button just says add to favorites, and if your favorites micro frontend is gone, you expect that this button is also gone, right? Because, I mean, if there is no favorites micro frontend, why should there be a button? What should it do? I mean, if it's defined somewhere else, why isn't it defined in the favorites micro frontend? And the same is true for this little heart that you see here in the preview of the movie, right? So you get all these things, and even though on the screen they appear completely interlaced, they are actually belonging to different groups, right? So it's not that you can just cut out a part of your UI and say this is one micro frontend. Actually, if you do it right, things will scatter very naturally. And you need to make sure that whatever solution you come up with can cope with that. So as an example, how can you now, let's say, use this? So there's a little video how additional functionality can be added now to this application. And for this video, there's a framework used called Pyral. I will not go into details of Pyral, and at the end we will have a look at something else like vanilla JavaScript. But just to give you the idea how a development flow might look like. So the basic goal of this exercise here is to add a new page with a new menu entry for getting a random selection of movies. So first, let's have a look at the application itself, so you can log in. It's just a demo application, so no real data, besides, of course, these things come from IMDb, etc. But anyway, so you see the menu, you can go there, you have something on your favorites, all working. So what to do now? You can use the command line, just scaffold the new micro frontend that gives you a basic NPM or Node.js project. And then you can go ahead and add whatever code you like to actually fulfill the purpose that you're here for. In this case, making this additional link and having that page. Now, the important part here is that we have this setup function. And sorry, this thing is going really fast, but again, the gist of it is you have the setup function, and you use it to, well, perform all kinds of registrations. So for instance, register menu item or register very generic component that can be used. Now, locally, you can already debug this, and this is an important part. You don't need a running environment somewhere. You can just, start this thing locally, and it will now just run your one micro frontend, which in this case is called a pilot, but that's just terminology for this one framework. And you can use a browser extension to bring in additional micro frontends. So suddenly, this thing looks really like the full application we've seen beforehand. It also brings in all these other components that have been registered, like, for instance, for the preview of a movie, right? So beforehand, you've just seen a blank space, but, well, important. This is not available on the online version. It's just locally. So this is localhost. You got your functionality that you developed here. And so the next thing you do, you bring it up to this discovery service, which in this case is called the Parallel Feed service. So you pack it, you create this tarball that we've seen beforehand, and then you either use a command line tooling, or in this case, we just use the web portal, click on upload, go there, have it in there. So there it appears, version 1.0.0. And if we now refresh, suddenly on the online version too, right? So this is an online version. You got now this surprise me button with the functionality. So you just deployed something new within 10 seconds or so, right? Add 5 minutes for development time. But that's essentially what a micro frontend solution should be able to give you, that you can make these rapid changes and you can go live. Great, so what options do you have now for this discovery service? There are some options out there besides, of course, creating your own. So one is, if you anyway are in AWS, they have a great open source project, the Frontend Discovery Service. It's tightly coupled, of course, to AWS concepts like Lambda functions, step functions, etc. It is opinionated in what kind of database you use, but I mean, you can just clone it, change the code, and there you go. The other thing is, within the Parallel framework, we also have an example how to create what we call a feed service. So that's a discovery service. And we have an example code out there. So this just uses in-memory, but again, you can just hack it, and it already gives you all the endpoints and everything you need. If you're fully into module federation, there's the option of using Medusa. This is a software as a service product. So here there is no version that you can run on-premise somewhere. So especially if you or your company or the project you're working on is really sensitive where things are stored, this might not be the best option. And in addition, it's only working with module federation, right? And it has a certain kind of deployment aspect. Always when you build, it deploys. Yeah. So, but it might be exactly what you need. And the last option is to use Pyro Cloud. So that's available as a free software as a service offering, but also a commercial Docker image that you can just run wherever you like. And it comes with several database and storage connectors and all that. And of course, if you would always ask me, I'm opinionated, so I would always go, of course, for the Pyro Cloud. But make no mistake, all these options might be something suitable for you. Good. So having that, a few use cases. One is blue-green deployments, really useful. So you have an old version, you come up with a new version, and what a discovery service should be able to do for you is that you scale up smoothly from one to the other, right? So you start with your old version at 100%, and the goal is to get 100% on the new version. And what you do in between is you monitor the error rates, right? So you got already some monitoring for your front ends that might be connected to something like LogRocket or something similar, where you can collect front-end errors in your backend, and you see if there is a significant spiking coming. And as long as everything looks good and flat, you keep on scaling it up. And then you reach 100% and everything is settled on the new version. So instead of doing this big bang, you would do a gradual thing. That's one of the things where a discovery service really can help you, because it can provision per request a different set of, let's say, micro-frontend composition. In difference, you have the canary release, quite similar concept, but instead of now scaling up gradually, and monitoring, for instance, errors, you rather define now a group for your canary release, and then you say, okay, let's bring this one up. And then you say, okay, at a certain point, let's have feedback on this user. So this might be some, I don't know, pilot customers or something, or internal users, and you first want to see what's their reaction to deploying the new micro-frontend. Another thing to consider is essentially what I talked before, and the independence. So if you go now for the discovery service, what it allows you to do is that you really now distinguish between, for instance, development of your app shell, so the layer that holds the orchestration, and the different micro-frontends. So of course you might want to have the first release of your app shell, because something needs to be there to orchestrate, right, and give maybe a layout. But from that point on, you're fully independent, right? So development of a next version of an app shell takes longer, you don't care. The micro-frontend A here that's developed, that can release independently many versions. They can also roll back if they want to. And likewise, as we've seen with the surprise me, they can just, of course, develop something new. And important, there is no line that now says, oh, we got version 1 of this should align with version 2 of the other thing. You really should bring in and embrace the independence. All right, and with this independence, you of course get now the ability to really stage, and that's a really great thing. Was taken from a project longer ago, but the nice thing about it was they had 4 environments for whatever reason, that in every environment, for every feature in the front end, and there are quite a couple of them, you were seeing what is currently active on already their standard DevOps means. So in this case, they used Azure DevOps, but it doesn't matter. You can connect this thing to what you might already use for microservices, and you get the same overview. And you get also, of course, the same capabilities. So here, for instance, if there would have been a problem, I can always roll back, and I can roll back these things individually, which is really great, because suddenly I'm in control on how my front end is composed, and I'm in control of these different pieces in what versions they are now rolled out. I was a little bit fast until here, and the only reason for me was, first, I want to take questions, but second, I also want to do a little bit of a demo and live coding to show you that now live, because it's always, you know, the video is fast, I'm talking fast, and seeing is better than just talking about it. So first thing first. The contrast doesn't look so good here, but anyway, so that's how this portal looks like of the feed service that I've shown before, and so that's a micro-frontend discovery service. And what I have in here, I have a couple of feeds, and one of these feeds I think is called something like a vanilla micro-frontend discovery demo. So I can just go in here and let's see. It at the moment lists 3 micro-frontends, blue, green, and red. That's great. Let me also bring another URL in here. Anyway. So that's a little demo. I always like to do this tractor store for micro-frontends, because it gives me everything I need to. It gives me assets, it gives me style sheets. Yeah, it's always a good working basis to show something. Also, everyone likes tractors. If you don't like a tractor, what's bringing your food on the table, right? So anyway, there is a tractor involved. It's a part of the process. Great. So this is a small demo application. As you can see, it has this button. It's working. It has this card. It's already also structured in an ideal way. So you got one thing, that's the product information. That's this page. So it's in red. It's the red dots. And it already has 2 other micro-frontends there. The green one, so this Team Inspire, so to speak. They have a related products component, and the blue micro-frontend has 2 components. One is this button, and another one is the cart. So the one is the shopping cart button to add something to the shopping cart, and the second one is the shopping cart, where you can see what's already added here. So far, so good. And now, of course, I can do interesting things or not. So I could, for instance, just shut down the blue micro frontend, right? And if I do that and I refresh, then the application is still working. I mean, it should. But, I mean, define working. If working means I can add something to the cart, well, of course it isn't, because I just deactivated that thing. But the application itself is working. So that might be something that you like to see. Great. So that's good. But that's, of course, a rather harsh way. That should be rather, let's say, the end of the life of a micro frontend, because why else would you want to deactivate it? So you can activate that again. And this team also made a little bit of, let's say, an experiment. They released a new version. It's 101. And maybe you want to set that active again. Well, first, maybe let's see that this thing is back again, right? So here it looks. We have the button. We have everything. Great. So far, so good. Now, we can just click on the star here. And if we now refresh, you realize that this thing suddenly has a little bit of a different layout. So now this button here has this golden background. Well, we now know why it was reverted, right? So it's maybe not the best design. But that's the basic idea. So you can just play around with things. You can even go a little bit further. You can say, OK, great, so far so good. Let's keep the background for now. But maybe let's not roll out this thing for everyone. Or maybe let's do this with the recommendations. I don't know. So that's the green micro frontend. So what you could do is you could now add a rule. Because again, you can now per request, make decisions, like the blue-green or the canary release, or in this case, and I like that very much for, let's say, demo purposes, just use a simple browser filter and say, maybe make that only available in Chrome, right? So I select Chrome, I hit save, and if I now refresh, oh, this thing is gone now. Great, or not great, depending on, you know, your attitude. And if I look in Chrome, well, here it is still there, right? I just refreshed, and Chrome still shows it. And therefore, great. This thing is also working. You can now, per user request, really get a different look, depending, of course, what you need and what kind of difference you like to make. So again, let's remove this, because I want to see it. Now, how would you now go about releasing maybe a new version of this button? Maybe the golden, well, we should remove this in the next version, but maybe we shouldn't have, let's say, the round corners. So what we could go for is, let's have a look, is we have this demo code here. It's just called PyroCloud Vanilla Demo. I don't have time to go now over all the code, but essentially what it does is exactly what we covered in this talk. It just communicates with our feed service, and then it provides some kind of a wrapper component, right? So the wrapper component is a little bit on top here, and we call it something like MF component. I don't know. Where is it? Here, MF component. That's just a web component, right? So no surprises here. But we have our individual micro frontends. They don't need to live in this repository, by the way. They could be in completely different repositories. They have also no knowledge of each other. Just this is also for demo purposes. So what we have in here is there's no setup function or anything. When this script here is called, so because the micro frontend is there, it will just register, call register component now, and it will register, for instance, our buy button. So our buy button lives here, buy button JS. We don't want to change this now. What we want to do is we don't want to have it golden, I don't know, white maybe. And we don't want to have the border radius. So I don't know, let's make it 0 for now. Then we should maybe give it a new version. So let me just do this. Let's choose 102. And finally, where are we here? Let's try to, what are we, blue? Let's try to publish. I just use here a script that's called deploy. So here it is, right? So we do that, npm run deploy. Hopefully I spelled it right. Great. So now a browser opens. You can't see that. Maybe you can in a second, so let me just show you this. There we go. I closed this one. Okay. Sorry. So this is what should show up. Anyway, I press now log in with my personal account because that does it quickly. Let's go back to VS Code. And it says it's publishing, response from server true. And let's hope that it all worked out. And well, I think I have it open in another window. Too many windows here. I think this is where we've been. Oh, it doesn't get into foreground. Shoot! I forgot the URL. No. No. Tractor store. Ah, good. There it is. So we just published it. That was more difficult in the deployment of it, right? Anyway, yeah. So that's how we can roll here. And now I'm open, of course, for questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Flo, for your talk. We have time for 2 questions. I would like you to choose which questions that you answer, okay?
Well, I first had a look at the shortest one, so let's cover that already. What goes into app shell? That's up to you. I would say everything that's cross-cutting. So, for instance, layout things should go into the app shell, usually. Something that are common concerns, like, for instance, authentication, that's usually going into the app shell. But again, at the end of the day, it's up to you. You can also say you make a very, very lightweight app shell that only has the bare minimum, which is the orchestrator. So that goes, for instance, to a feed, grabs the information on the micro frontends, and then from there on, the micro frontends work. So it's completely up to you. The only recommendation I can give you, really don't put too much in there. Because, for instance, if you already make central sharing of dependencies, that's all burdens that the app shell carries, so you need to take care of that in the central team, and you want to avoid that as much as possible. Just put in the shared concerns, and you're good.
Okay. This one has been upvoted here, this question by Michael about ordering the buttons. Could you answer that one quickly?
Yeah, so there are, let's say, multiple strategies. One strategy is the same as, for instance, a Z-index in CSS. You can use some kind of a property, could be either an order property, or for this kind of a component, for the host component, you use anyway something like a flex box. So the component could define it on its own, for instance, via the flex order property. So that is, of course, a strategy. But the downside of that strategy is, like with a Z-index in CSS, there's a battle for the largest number. So everyone's saying, but I'm more important. So maybe you don't want to leave that decision to the micro frontend. And so what you could also do is, and what, for instance, in Pyro, what we've done is that you can reorder that from the hosting component. And then you can, of course, choose whatever metric. Again, it could be something like an order property, or you could choose a name or whatever and make that alphabetically. Or maybe you have some information in your backend stored and they already give you, let's say, a priority list or something like that. And the end of the day, it's fully up to you again how to decide that, and depending on what kind of project and what kind of, let's say, compositions, is it menu buttons, etc. we're talking about, it might be something else that you're looking for, but those are the basic 2 strategies. So either leave it to the micro frontends via some kind of a property, or choose it from the hosting component, from the hosting micro frontend. The latter is usually what you want, because it gives you more consistency, but yeah.
Thank you very much. I have one question for you.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the workshop that's happening at 3 o'clock in the sponsor area?
Which workshop?
It's the Azure infrastructure for monitoring 24,000.
I need to go there. Don't say anything more.
24,000 by 40 Docker containers by Tesco. It's at 3 o'clock. It looks amazing. I have a gift for you. It's a Budapest custom-made book and a picture that I must show the camera. And I present these 2 things to you. Big round of applause for Dr. Florian, everybody.